I'm Dave Potter with Digital Journal, and we're here at Inventures, and I'm joined by Benjamin Bergen from the Canadian Council of Innovators. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So for those who aren't aware of what CCI is, can you give me a rundown, a little bit of an overview?
Yeah, so super high level, we're a business council that does advocacy work for scaling technology companies. So we've got over 185 member companies right across the country, really looking at how do you build a tech ecosystem that supports Canadian firms to be successful and really drive innovation. And so at the council, we really put domestic firms really at the center of the policy that we advocate for. And so the four kind of big buckets that we look at are things like access to capital. So these will be all the different types of government programs there are. We'll look at areas like access to talent. So, are we training the right people? Do we have the right kind of immigration policies in place? We look at things like procurement and is government actually buying domestic innovation and technology, and what does that lead to? And then the fourth bucket, which is kind of the sort of most techie thing that we do, or ephemeral, is really what we call marketplace frameworks or freedom to operate. And so these are all the things that government decides what is permissible and what's not, thinking around things like privacy or IP, data, standards, international trade agreements, which increasingly seem to be less valuable these days. But how do those things interplay and actually impact the way that firms are able to not only grow here in Canada, but around the world?
So you, the CCI, just launched a mandate to innovate, your new policy report. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we do is we actually go out and engage with our domestic firms or our members, and we connect with their CEOs, their CTOs, folks deep sort of within these organizations, and we figure out what are the pain points that you're experiencing, and how do we begin to sort of correct or make policies better. And so a mandate to innovate is really looking at sort of the current moment that we're in right now in Canada. And by a lot of economic indicators, we're in trouble, right? We've seen real GDP per capita actually decline. We've seen the number of globally headquartered firms that are based here in Canada drop significantly. And overall, sort of the economic challenges that we're facing are pretty abundant. And so we actually need a response that looks at how do we build an innovative economy. And so our mandate to innovate policy basically covers sort of the key ministries that actually have levers to pull and looks at how do we build an all-of-government approach in order to respond to the moment that we're in. And so in it, we create 43 recommendations that specifically look at different policy levers that the government can use federally and provincially as well in order to try and build a more successful local ecosystem.
You frame innovation as a national security issue. Why is that, and how is that? Why now?
Yeah, so maybe to kind of take a bit of a step back, for us, Canada's ability to actually participate in a 21st century economy is tied to national sovereignty. It's a little bit like when we built this country and we built the railroad. Imagine if we had allowed, foreign entities to control the railroad. Imagine if we had allowed them to build it or to determine what goods we could or could not put on it. It ultimately wouldn't allow us to be a sovereign nation. And so when we think about, the 21st century and we think about what are the domestic capacities that we as Canadians need to have, our real premise is that we have to have a few areas where we're world leaders and we really can participate in the economy that's going on. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in a much more difficult situation where rather than actually being leaders in certain sectors, we'll find ourselves at the risk of other geopolitical entities. And I think, up until about a year ago, I would say some of the language that we've been talking about at the Council of Canadian Innovators may have not been perceived as, much of a threat. But given what we've seen south of the border, where, we have a president who is, bent on trying to destroy our economy or cause major challenges in it, the sort of general assumptions around a rules-based approach to economic growth and prosperity is eroding. And so the response for us is, what do open small economies do that are successful, and how do we be able to protect ourselves in that type of environment? And for us at the council, it's having things that the world wants and things that the world needs to buy in order to shore up our strength. And the kind of best example I'll give you is thinking about the Netherlands. So they're world leaders in a lithography machine which creates semiconductors, and each one of these machines costs about $400 million to make. And they're so vital in this sector of semiconductor capacity building that President Biden had to go there twice to politely ask them no longer to sell it to the Chinese or to other actors that they viewed as potential threats to U.S. Chip domination. And I think that's the kind of space that we as Canadians need to get ourselves into, where we have forms of technology and expertise that are so vital that fundamentally it gives us a real edge to participate into global conversations and to be leaders in those areas.
There have been sort of innovation strategies in the past. What makes this one different?
Yeah, so what I would say is fundamentally different about the Council of Canadian Innovators is that we put domestic firms really at the center of the policy work that we do. So all of those recommendations are coming from actual practitioners who are actually trying to build a business and scale it and go global. Whereas, previously some of the, the policies and ideas that get put forward don't actually look at that type of domestic capacity building. So, let's take something like the big auto package that, was announced for electric vehicles, right? Upwards of more than $40 billion for companies like Honda and Stellantis, right? That's us putting bets on foreign companies being successful in that universe. But the fundamental piece here that governments are failing to understand is that's a job strategy. So that's maybe creating some good jobs in southwestern Ontario. But in terms of the actual wealth and prosperity that's being created, no Canadians own any of those actual technologies that are being deployed. All that's essentially being hired for is labor. And so if we want to kind of flip the script, how do we actually become the owners of ideas and actually sell those? And that's where the real, A, expertise comes from, but B, also the ability to generate, wealth and prosperity. And so when you look at our recommendations, that's fundamentally what it does, is it looks at how do you build the capacity for Canadians to generate ideas, own ideas, and then sell those ideas to the rest of the world.
And you call for the creation of a new innovation department or agency. How does that differ from existing groups like NRC or other existing programs?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're really sort of pushing for, and there have been discussions about it a number of years ago, was the creation of the Canadian Innovation Corporation. And for us, building an organization which does a lot more coordination around where we as Canadians, put our capacity and focus is critical. So, when we look at something like the SHRED program as an example, 18,000 companies receive it, right? I mean, that is a real pray and spray approach to innovation. Whereas if you look at other successful open small economies, they actually really, hyper focus on where they have capacity, where they have large problems that they want to solve and really sort of look at. And so one of the things that we're pushing for at the council is by building a structure that actually has that type of foresight and ability to do long-term planning and to begin to sort of direct and create the sort of market frameworks where firms can be successful, you'll get a lot better outcomes in terms of the current status and approach that we're taking. And so for us, that's a unique organization that sits as a layer, not just in sort of one specific sector or area, but does a lot more sort of national coordination.
You also call for procurement to focus more on the government being the biggest buyer of Canadian goods. How do you foresee that change sort of rolling out?
Yeah. So look, procurement is like a perennial challenge that we've had in this country for a long time. And, I'm sure, listeners will know the old adage, like no one gets fired for hiring IBM. And really there's a challenges in terms of how our system is structured, and it's a bit different federally and provincially. But the big issue here is that we often don't even know what are the actual domestic capacities that we have in this country. And so when our own procurers are actually going out and looking for solutions, there isn't an ability for them to even sort of interrelate with firms that we're funding from an R&D perspective. One, example that I'll give you is, we've had now a real narrative of provincial governments and premiers advocating for domestic procurement. And we also have had the federal government do the same thing. We got to strengthen and build capacity. And so, let's say areas like defense. We had Prime Minister Mark Carney before the election up in Nunavut making an announcement of about a $6 billion contract for defense technologies to strengthen our ability to, determine if incoming missiles are coming from, the north or, from Russia. And it turns out that the contract that was signed was for an Australian startup, overnight sort of transforming them into a $1 billion business, but that our own government, through our defense research spending, was actually funding 2 companies in Canada that was actually doing that work already. So here we have a bit of a challenge where you see that in some cases our government is going out and procuring solutions that we're also trying to fund the R&D of, and creating this real mismatch. So, you see real challenges like that sort of permeate everywhere. But then also, you'll see language and not to pick on Premier Doug Ford too much, but, big champion in terms of being a communicator around how we got to support Canada during these tensions that we have with the United States, saying we're going to procure Canadian. We're going to, cut up our Starlink contract and agreement. But then at the other side of it, putting in a clause where if you have more than 250 employees in Ontario, you're considered an Ontario company. You're considered a Canadian company. And so, how many foreign, big firms have more than 250 employees in the province? Most of them, right? And so that's the sort of dynamic that you get into where rhetoric and language is often not the same. And procurement is the biggest economic driver that we can actually use. Like, ask any company or CEO, they would much rather a purchase order than a grant or a subsidy. A purchase order, builds a business. You can take it to the bank and try and go and, take out a loan. You can then take that product and then go and try and sell it to other governments. And one of the big issues that a lot of our member companies or companies in Canada face is that if our own government isn't going to buy their solution, why should another government around the world? And that's often the first question that gets asked is, oh, does your own government buy it? Oh, if not, why not? Is it no good? Is there an issue with it? What's the problem? So that's the other thing, is that this is also part of an ability for us to be able to take these high value goods and then sell them around the world.
So when you're looking at the procurement alignment and you talk about taking a more centralized approach, how do you manage the battles between provincial turf?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's part of like the challenge of obviously like, the federation and sort of working through those pieces. I think, as a business council that's focused on, sort of tangible outcomes that are looking at public policy, areas that we've tried to be supportive is often, bringing different conveners or groups together. So, on stuff like, let's say, healthcare procurement, right? How do we work with our federal regulator at Health Canada to speed up processes for technologies to be implemented faster in the country? And then how do we work with provinces to say, hey, these are the great technologies that we've got in this country. How do you want to actually sort of implement or move them forward? And so, we're not a big buffer between, the feds and the province in terms of trying to mitigate, obviously, some of the challenges we have with our Dominion, but we do try and create opportunities where there's engagement and connection.
One of the other things you talk about is talent, and that Canada is a big exporter of inventors. How do you think you go about addressing that? What's the first step?
Yeah, so this is like a bit of a chicken and the egg, issue. I think maybe just sort of highlight some of the positive things. Like, look, we're a country that believes in the rule of law. We believe in truth, love, and justice. Like, we believe in some pretty good things. And I think that is inherently, a good place for us to be trying to attract, highly talented and skilled people, because they often want to work in environments where, the rule of law actually means something. So, from that level, I think there's an opportunity for us to try and pull in talent from around the world to come to this place. However, the reality has been for the last, long period of time, and I think, we even mention it in our report specifically, that we're actually the largest, we're the third largest net exporter of innovators in the world. So we're behind India and China, countries with much larger populations, and those, folks predominantly go to the U.S. We also had a record number of Canadians go to the United States last year. And so for us, the way that we look at it is a couple of different ways. There's definitely, I would say, call it the tax issue. And so, we're not an organization that's big on, lower taxes and everything will be fine, but we do have to be competitive. And the cap gains issue that happened last year, where the finance minister, was going to move forward with that policy, really hurt the ecosystem in a big way, and not just from a founder or CEO position. It also impacted highly skilled workers. If you're going to be taxed at really high rates, and it's a small risk that you're actually going to be a successful firm that's going to be able to receive that, you want to do it in the place where you got the best opportunity to do it. And so what we heard and really experienced was that around some of the taxation policy, it was just becoming too difficult to raise capital. It was becoming too difficult to find highly skilled workers that were required to be the jet fuel to build them, and really dampened the opportunity for those firms. So that's like one piece of it, is sort of a tax area. The other, I would say, is some of the other ancillary things that can be done. So, how do you reduce red tape, remove friction, make starting businesses easier? And then how do you also look at supporting and funding them as well? And, some of the elements or kind of numbers to sort of dive into is that we as Canadians actually spend a tremendous amount of taxpayer dollars on specific programs, but when you dig into it, not all of those funds are actually going to supporting domestic firms. So I'll give you a good example. The Strategic Innovation Fund, since 2018, has deployed close to about $8 billion. Turns out about 68% of it has gone to foreign multinational firms that are operating subs here in Canada. And so the result then is that in a fund that's meant to be for strategic innovation, we're ultimately subsidizing the R&D of foreign countries and foreign governments, and ultimately allowing for them to profit off of taxpayers hard-earned money. And so looking at ways of redeploying that capital to make sure that it's actually leading to outputs is, I think, a good way of being able to keep people here. Because look, I think the value structure is there. The question is now, can we build the economic framework to match it?
You called for an innovation-focused cabinet. How'd they do?
So look, I think we are going to see what that looks like once mandate letters are released, right? And that, I think, will sort of be the proof is in the pudding. I think, we saw, obviously, Minister Evan Solomon be announced, who's the Minister of AI and Digital Adoption. And I think that is a positive sign that you're seeing that there's a specific focus on that, and that the government is taking this seriously. Now the question becomes, how will it relate to the other ministries? How will it engage with them? And then what is the actual underpinning or mandate that's put there? So for us, we're still a little bit of a hurry up and wait on some of that stuff. But as someone who tries to be perennially optimistic, we'll see what that looks like maybe after the speech from the throne after May 27th.
You mentioned mandate letters. If you were writing the mandate letter for Minister Solomon, what's a key thing for you?
Yeah. So this is in our mandate to innovate, right, which really kind of plays on sort of the mandate piece. So I think the key areas that I would say is, one, how do you have a whole of government approach around something like AI? So some of the pieces that we put forward there is, do you actually have the data and privacy policies in place? One of the things that died in the last legislative session was ADA, which was legislation specifically around like the use of AI and what that meant, for Canadians, but also for corporations. And so if you don't even have a roadmap of how you're going to be able to use data from a commercialization perspective and what that roadmap looks like over a period of time, it becomes really hard to make decisions about where you want to sort of spend your time and energy as a company. So one of the things that we really have to clean up is our regulatory space and really build clear roadmaps for AI companies on what that looks like. So that's like one component. I think the other big piece is obviously on the procurement piece. How do we actually get AI technologies ingested not only into our bureaucracy, but also into traditional industries, right? All companies will become AI and data companies if they're going to survive. And so how do we help our, let's say, larger, more traditional industries actually innovate and use this technology? And the government there has, a number of levers which we sort of look at, from, taxation to incentives to other opportunities. And I think that will be a big piece there, that if we're not able to get our own domestic firms to do that, we're going to find ourselves sliding even further behind. I think one of the examples we give in the report is that in the United States, about 50% of firms are now using some form of, artificial intelligence. And I don't know if that's just, ChatGPT on the side of someone's desk, but in Canada, that number is around 10%. So it is dramatically much lower. And so that challenge of us not actually adopting this technology will impact us sooner rather than later, because of the way that the technology empowers the ability to create productivity.
If you're looking forward and sort of into 2030 and you had to pick one metric to track progress, what's the one thing you'd keep an eye on?
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. I think, from us at the council, we use revenue as our sort of metric of where things are going. And to be a member of CCI, you have to be, a revenue generating firm. And look, it's not a perfect metric, but there are no perfect ones. But for us, that's a sign that you found product market fit. It's a sign that you have found, people who are willing to buy the ideas that you're selling. And, part of the metrics that I think that we've really struggled with in this country is that we often look at things like jobs numbers, But actually in an innovation economy, what you're essentially doing is eliminating jobs by finding more efficient ways of doing things or removing labor or more challenges. And so for us, I would say the revenue component is obviously probably the biggest sort of metric we would use at our organization. I don't know if that's the right one for governments, because that's not how they inherently need to sort of be only focused on. But for us, if you're able to create and generate more and more revenue, that's a sign that you found some form of success.
And sort of speaking of governments, if you were to give them one message to take away from this new report, or what would it be?
Yeah, the big one is have a relationship with innovators. And that sounds real simple, but figuring out how you relate to the folks that are actually building companies and figuring out what supports they need to have in order to scale and grow is how all successful jurisdictions do it. It's what Taiwanese do. It's what the Nordics do. It's what the Americans do. Is you build these relationships where you're able to find opportunities to collaborate and build strength. And the policies that we put forward in a mandate to innovate are in a moment, right? They are what is needed now. But that stuff changes over time, and things need to be reiterated, reimagined, repurposed, and sort of thought about kind of collectively. And so if you don't have those data points of figuring out, are there actual companies that are solving problem X within the government? Can we procure that? You're unable to unlock a lot of the opportunity. So for us, it's have a relationship, create structures where government can hear and engage collaboratively in order to build a better ecosystem.
And what would your message be to the innovators in the country who are tired of waiting for change? Yeah.
So look, for me, democracy is a verb. It's not a noun, right? It's something that you do. And it's not something that just happens in an election. It's not just supporting, a blue team or a red team and everything's fine, because, the government of the day is there and they're the ones that are responsive for the ecosystem. One of the big things that I think surprised a lot of innovators is some of the successes that we've had as an organization, and that really is about collectively coming together. So if you think that not engaging with government is not part of your business, you're wrong. Engaging with government in terms of the sort of various policy levers that I talked about is actually critical. Now, they may not all be as important. But the example that I'll give is Amazon met with the Prime Minister's office about 100 times in 2022. That's about twice a year. What were they having conversations about? Why were they engaging with them? And it's because that there's opportunities around things like procurement, of understanding where things are flowing and how to engage with them. And we at the council really are that sort of counter voice that's trying to come in and say, look, you got to support domestic players. Innovators are often building their companies. So they don't have time to be doing that type of deep engagement. But that's really where we sort of step in as an organization. And so what I would say is, figure out how to engage, figure out what is the right sort of cadence for your organization. But ecosystems are created. They're not just sort of laissez-faire economics. They're actually built through regulations and public policy that are influenced by those that show up and have conversations.
And final question, we sort of talked about the political side, we've talked about the innovators. Yeah. What would be your one message to sort of the average Canadian who's not necessarily involved?
Yeah. So I think the big piece that I would say here is that you might not think this impacts you, but it impacts you. So because we've struggled to build an innovation economy, our actual prosperity is declining. And the reason why we find things more expensive and more onerous to purchase is because our actual purchasing power is declining. And when you compare that with other G7 nations or even G20 nations, you see that increasingly we're beginning to sort of slide down that metric. And if it wasn't for the oil that we had in Alberta or natural resources, we would actually be in a lot more of a dire situation. And to give you an example of this, you've got in the United States, people with incomes that are about 40% higher than Canadians. That's real money in your jeans. In Australia, you've got about 25% more wealth for the average worker. And in the Netherlands as well, it's about 20%. And so you can't blame it on socialism, you can't blame it on capitalism, and you can't blame it on a resource curse. It's the actual policies and structures that impact our ability to capture wealth that are at play. And so for Canadians, the reality is that, you're getting poorer because we're not figuring out how to do things more efficiently and more effectively. And that will only continue. And history is a moving peace, and countries that were once rich can become poor, and countries that were once poor can become very wealthy. And, think of Argentina, once one of the richest countries in the world, and, is the only country that has slid backwards in terms of the global index. Or look at Korea, right? Once one of the poorest countries up until the 1950s, 1960s, and is now viewed as one of the most innovative in the world. So these things can change, but you actually have to be engaged with them. And I don't think that this is like the number one ballot issue for people when they go to the voting booth, but economic strength and economic sovereignty should be something that at least is part of the equation.
That's great. Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Thanks. Oh, sorry.
For more on innovation news in Canada, go to digitaljournal.com.